Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being willing to come out and join us today. We're looking forward to a robust discussion over the next hour to hour and a half. I want to start with introductions and thank yous to folks who helped make today possible. My name is Matt Hickey. I serve as the campus co-chair for the Heterodox Academy community on campus, along with Arnold Cantu, who's a doctoral student in social work. Today's event was made possible by a partnership of sponsors between the Department of History and the Heterodox Academy community here at CSU. Heterodox Academy nationally is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership community that has about 7,000 members on campuses all over the world. And they sponsor 50 campus communities at the moment. That includes Front Range partners at DU, CU, and up the road in the University of Wyoming as well. And so we have opportunities to collaborate, to think together with community partners here all along the Front Range. Our national meeting is coming up in Chicago in just a few weeks. We look forward to that as well. I'll tell you a little bit about why Heterodox Academy exists. They're founded on 3 pillars, and this is our first broad public meeting. I want to make sure we have a platform for framing today's discussion. So 3 key pillars for the Heterodox Academy. They include open inquiry. Open inquiry is the ability to ask questions, to share ideas, and to challenge existing orthodoxy without risk of censure. In an environment that's sufficiently open, people can explore facts, opinions, and beliefs, discover and create important innovations, solve problems, and flourish intellectually. The second pillar for Heterodox Academy is viewpoint diversity. Viewpoint diversity is when members of a group or community approach problems or questions from a range of perspectives, backgrounds, and personal experiences. When a community is marked by intellectual humility, empathy, trust, curiosity, viewpoint diversity then gives rise to engaged and respectful debate, constructive disagreement, and shared progress towards truth. The third pillar is this notion of constructive disagreement. Constructive disagreement occurs when people who have different perspectives on an idea or an issue are committed to collaboratively exploring and learning from one another. Rigorous, open, and responsible engagement across lines of difference is the foundation of healthy academic practice. It is essential to making good ideas better, and that's what we're committed to modeling today and as we move into the future. So I want to lay out a little bit of what we can expect over the next 90 minutes to perhaps 2 hours, depending on sort of the nature of the interaction with the community and our speakers. We'll start in just a moment with about an hour of back and forth between our 2 conversants today, and I want to introduce them. Dr. Ann Little is a professor of history here at CSU. Dr. Holly Lawford-Smith is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Melbourne. She's the author of a number of books. In fact, as we were walking down the hallway today, we've got others that are already in the queue. She's published 3 just in the last few years. The book that is going to be the focus for discussion today is Gender Critical Feminism. So we're going to have a conversation between our 2 hosts for about an hour. Then we're going to open it up to engagement from attendees. I'll be the sort of traveling microphone, so just give me sort of a wave of the hands, and I'm happy to come get the mic in your hands, and we look forward to a lively discussion. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Ann, who's going to make a more formal introduction of our special guest today, and I'll find myself a seat.
Thanks, Matt, and welcome to everybody here. I know it's a really busy finals week going into a very busy exam week, especially for your students. So I really appreciate everybody's effort to come out here and engage with us. Our guest today is Holly Lawford-Smith. She's an associate professor in political philosophy in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne in Australia. I just found out today, as I was bringing her up from the airport, that she's in fact a Kiwi. She did her bachelor's degree and master's degree at the University of Otago in Dunedin in New Zealand, and she did her PhD at the Australian National University in Canberra. After a couple of postdocs in Canberra, at Charles Sturt University and at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at Charles Sturt University, and then with the Department of Philosophy in the Research School of Social Sciences at the Australian National University. She took a permanent job, her first permanent job, as a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Sheffield in the UK. But then in early 2017, she moved back to Australia to work at the University of Melbourne, which is where she still teaches. Although she's been on sabbatical this year at Chapman University. That's correct? Yes. Holly's books very prolific. She's a very prolific scholar. Holly's books include Not in Their Name, Are Citizens Culpable for Their State's Actions, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Gender Critical Feminism, the topic of our talk today, which was also published by Oxford University Press in 2022. Since then, she's published 2 more books, Sex Matters, Essays in Gender Critical Philosophy, also published by Oxford University Press in 2023. And then with Angie Pepper, she wrote a book called Is It Wrong to Buy Sex, which is published by Routledge in New York just this year. She's also an editorial board for political philosophy and the Journal of Controversial Ideas, and is a monthly columnist for Colette and a featured author at a new feminist sort of blog, Fairer Disputations. Yes? Right. Well, welcome, Holly. I've asked Holly to prepare maybe a 5 or 10 minute overview of her book, its main argument, its structure, to share with you, and then I will start asking her questions that I have. I should also say this is meant to be an interdisciplinary conversation. I'm a historian. Holly's a philosopher. I can't pretend that my dumb historian brain fully understood all of her, philosophical sort of inquiries. Although I will say the book is written in a very lucid, very accessible format. So I would encourage people who might otherwise be inclined to be intimidated by a work of philosophy to go ahead and dive in, because I found it very accessible. At least I think I did. You could tell me if I got anything wrong. But anyway, I'll turn it over to Holly. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I started writing this book in 2019, and the context is that the UK the year before had started this consultation over their Gender Recognition Act to move from a sort of 2-year gatekeeping-ish model to sex self-identification. It was a very vitriolic public debate, and as many of you probably know, a particular philosopher, Kathleen Stock, had spoken out against the move to sex self-identification at the time and been roundly criticized, not just in public, but by philosophy as a discipline, or at least segments of philosophy. We can talk about how widely shared that was. That piqued my curiosity and interest in what was going on there, what the issues were, and kind of why she was being so dogpiled. So I started thinking about these issues, trying to learn more about what was going on. I pitched this book to Oxford University Press. I got a contract and started writing. What I was trying to do is figure out, what is this movement? There's all these women using this name, gender critical feminist, and kind of organizing under that name, but it didn't seem to me clear exactly what the commitments were. In particular, it didn't seem clear to me whether it was just, as it was being called by its opponents, like centered on resistance to the move to sex self-ID, so it was essentially reactionary against trans politics, or there was something wider and bigger going on. I had a lot of questions about that, so I kind of wanted to be just a little bit arrogant probably, but like the first person to do like the theory of what is gender critical feminism. Unfortunately, I was beaten by other people writing books. This was, I think, the 3rd or 5th or something book is the way that things worked out. But anyway, that was my goal, try to understand this movement, try to do some helpful philosophical contribution to make sense of what's going on here and what are the ideas, and make sense of some of the opposition to it as well, and state what I think is really going on there. And if I'm really honest, to also put forward something that could be going on there, even if it isn't going on there yet. So to make a kind of offer, like maybe here's something we might mean and we might be unified by, and might give us an agenda going forward. So maybe we're preoccupied with this issue now, but here's the rest of the agenda for when we get past that particular issue. So the structure of the book, I think of it as kind of separate. There's 2 parts, but it's sort of separated into the thing. What's the thing? What is gender critical feminism? Trying to give a statement of that. And that's mainly done in terms of trying to tie it back to radical feminism as it emerged during the second wave of feminism, and argue that gender critical feminism is a kind of revival or picking up again of that feminist tradition which we have lost. trying to state kind of what its paradigm issues are. And so what I do in the book, which might be slightly strange, is to say the rad femmes were really preoccupied with the sex industry, prostitution and pornography as their issues. Which is much more cynical, actually, is just that all of this hate is really just political propaganda by the sex self-identification side. And it's working, by the way, because when you put this view out in the public sphere that this feminist position is beyond the pale, that it's exclusionary, that it's transphobic, that it's racist, so on and so on and so on, of course, anyone on the fence or anyone who doesn't know anything about that theory or movement wants to stay well away from it. So that's a third sort of possible explanation that we can argue about, or maybe you have some ideas that I don't have in that chapter. That's as far as I go, trying to sort of really figure out what might be going on here. And then part 2 of the book, which I won't really go into any details of, but I'm happy to talk more about in the discussion, or maybe it will come up with Anne. Part 2 is called Hard Questions for Gender Critical Feminists. Maybe that's a bit me just indulging the philosopher, like maybe most people don't get that far in the book, but me just trying to think through, yeah, like we have this theory now and I kind of understand what it's about, but there are these like residual questions. Is gender critical feminism intersectional? There's a sense that every feminism today has to be intersectional, and I argue that it's not, and try to make the case for that. I have a chapter on whether gender critical feminism is feasible. Again, I think there's a tendency with utopian style political philosophy or political ideology to sort of dismiss it when it's got big plans, like abolish the sex industry. Okay, so call that infeasible, and then just that's an excuse not to think about it more. So I try to figure out what it would mean to vindicate a claim like that and to be able to just stop thinking about these things. And then the final chapter is on liberalism. And again, that kind of just came out of possibly almost just a conflation with the fact that our enemy, like the enemy of radical and gender critical feminism, is often stated as liberal feminism. It's like the rad femmes versus the lib femmes. And then there's just this question of, is that really an ideological disagreement? Is there something about liberalism and something about radicalism, or something about revolutionaries versus reformists, or something? Is there some real principle that is dividing these two groups? And how does gender critical feminism really fit in under the liberal umbrella? Is it a liberal project? And then, yeah, just have some various ideas in that bit. But that's the sort of shape of the book, saying what it is, trying to deal with some hard questions. And then it ends with a manifesto, which I crowdsourced from Twitter, gender critical people. Yeah.
All right, I've got a hard question for you.
Good.
Is gender critical feminism anti-trans? I want to explain the context for this question a little bit. The Heterodox Academy coordinator at CSU, Matt HxA, has received a few emails this week in advance of your talk expressing concern that, for example, you are, quote, likely to indicate that a portion of the student body on this campus does not have the right to identify the way that they do, and that, quote, the gender critical feminism movement openly discriminates against trans women, practically denying their existence, unquote. So I'll repeat the initial question. Is gender critical feminism anti-trans?
Okay, can I give my answer, but then can we go back to the quotes? I hope this is not a too comical way to make the point, but here's an analogy. So someone comes up to you, they don't have a weapon, they're roughly your size, and they demand you to give your wallet to them, and you refuse. Are you a bigot? Or are you an asshole in some way? No, that's my intuition. That's how I think about feminism, not being willing to hand over all of its resources that it still needs to trans activism. So what does feminism need? It needs a concept of sex class and the oppression of female people for thousands of years, in better or worse in different countries. It needs the language to be able to talk about sex and sex oppression and that class of people. And I think it really needs the diagnosis of women's situation that was developed and emphasized in the second wave using the word and concept gender. So the second wave concept of gender in the sex gender distinction is this way that people are made to be, channeled to be, socialized to be on the basis of their sex. Those are crucial, I would say, indispensable concepts for feminist theory and analysis. And all that we are guilty of is not handing them away when another minority group, I would say, appropriated them. Because now the claim is that it's not that there's this other thing, gender identity, and it's separate. No, it's that gender now is identity. That's the claim. That is an appropriation of a concept that we really need to do our theory and analysis. So maybe the analogy is a little bit stupid, but to me it's like, yeah, are you anti-trans for not handing over all your stuff as soon as you were asked to? Absolutely not. And I don't think we would have the intuition that that was the case in any other scenario that had that structure. Would
you like me to reread the quotes?
Can you?
Okay. The first was that you are likely to indicate that a portion of the student body on this campus does not have the right to identify the way that they do. And the second quotation is the gender critical feminist movement openly discriminates against trans women, practically denying their existence.
I'm going to try to be as generous as possible about this. If it counts as discrimination to deny that somebody is what they say they are, then I think there's no getting around the fact that the gender critical feminist movement does deny. They don't believe in change of sex. They hang on to the concept of sex and they think it's biological and immutable. And they don't think that gender is identity, as I've just described. They think gender is a thing that is done to people on the basis of their sex. So a female person subject to relentless attempts to make her feminine, that's the thing they're picking out with the concept gender. So when a gender critical feminist says trans women are men, which is the most offensive thing I think that's the boldest statement of the thing that's taken to be the most offensive. Trans women are men. But they don't mean I deny your gender identity. That I believe that gender is identity and I'm denying that you are the authority on your own one. Of course you are. I just don't really care much about your gender identity. That's not interesting to me as a feminist or part of my feminist analysis. And I'm keeping my word gender. We, the movement, are keeping our word gender for the thing that we want to analyze and talk about. So in a way, this is a fight over terms, right? You're denying me this word, that what I mean by it is my identity. If that's what woman is, an identity, then yeah, we're denying it because we think it means something else. And we meant that first, by the way.
I think this question kind of it raises the question of, is disagreement hateful? Is it hateful to disagree with somebody?
Yeah. And I guess, well, yeah, a lot of us in the room are going to say no. Again, just to try to be as charitable as possible, I guess there are some things where we do think it's beyond the pale to disagree about them. We think there are some things where morally they have become settled now. And we don't want to have those discussions, or if we hear people make certain claims, we do think that's discriminatory or that's bigoted or whatever. Maybe this whole debate will get to that point in 5, 10, 20 years, and it'll get settled to one side or the other, and then we will think anyone who says the side that didn't win, that does count as being beyond the pale or as being discriminatory. But this is a live debate. Like this has all just started kind of coming out for serious public consideration rather than just in smaller subcultures in the last 5 years or so. This has become a big issue here in the last few years, if I understand correctly. Like I think that's in the media routinely. So we have to have that discussion. Maybe we will lose. I hope not. Maybe we will lose, but we haven't lost yet. So I don't think that disagreement can be hateful yet.
Yes. Okay.
That's my answer. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I want to explore this idea of your concept of a fundamental moral disagreement, which I found a really fascinating philosophy way of approaching the problem. So, and you kind of alluded to this in your sort of overview or introduction to your book for the audience here. But here's my question, and then I'll give you a little context. Given your understanding of the global history of contemporary feminism, how do you understand the hostility to or even fear of gender critical feminism by some transgender activists and gender ideology advocates? Because it's been a little astonishing to me seeing the monstering of children's author J.K. Rowling and other gender critical feminists. Most of them seem to be kind of middle-aged moms like J.K. Rowling, or middle-aged lesbians, or middle-aged lesbian moms like Kathleen Stock. So this is not traditionally a population who can credibly be accused of hating anyone or wanting to kill or erase or commit a genocide against anyone. So maybe it struck me that your concept of the fundamental moral disagreement was maybe a way into understanding this, if I read your book correctly. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about the way you explain in your book about how equality was your sort of your entry example into explaining that concept, and to how a fundamental moral disagreement is sort of takes shape.
Okay, I'm going to lose track, so can you steer me? I'll
Yes,
just do the
I will.
first bit. Yeah, so the idea is supposed to be something like, often you can state your principle, your moral reason, and then you can ask why you're committed to that or what your reasons are for that. But at some point that bottoms out at just a normative commitment. And so the thought with equality was, and this goes back to a long ago book by Jim Flynn and Dunedin, actually, that equality is one of those values. It's just at the end of the chain, and you can't really argue well with someone who doesn't get it. So if your reason is like, well, society should be organized like this because all human individuals are moral equals, and they are like, no, I love hierarchy, it's really hard to know how you're supposed to bring them around. So that's the idea of fundamental moral disagreement. It's at the end of this sort of chain of reasons. There's not much more you can say. Most people just get it. And if you disagree about those things, you tend to just be horrified. And again, I think you're horrified partly because there are no resources other than that. Like if you can't do reasons after that, then you've only got your emotional reactions or your alienation or your social sanctioning of the person to try to bring them on side. So that was what I was trying to, and I guess so in the context of the debate between the sort of trans activists and the gender critical feminists, maybe it's inclusion, which I mentioned already. So there's a really strong focus. Maybe I think that's the main value these days, or again, if people disagree, I'm happy to talk about that. But there's also a confluence of other moral principles, maybe more on the left. Again, that's what I know more. But so one being this idea that you should defer to the least well off. That's quite a well-entrenched principle. So again, if you have the idea that there's quite a marginalized minority group, then the thought is like, well, yeah, they should be prioritized in the social justice movement, or you should defer to their testimony about their own oppression. And so maybe there's a bit of that going on too, because this is sort of thought that trans people fit this profile, so then everyone else in the feminist or leftist progressive movements should be deferring, and then gender critical feminists look terrible because they're not, right? They're absolutely failing. So that's the thought. You've got your fundamental moral disagreement idea, and then you've got to fill in exactly what are the plausible values at the bottom of that there is this disagreement about between the sides. Did I miss anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay,
That's good.
okay.
Okay. Now I'm going to turn and ask some questions that are about history. Because I really enjoyed your intellectual history of second wave, mostly US-based feminism in your second chapter. Gender critical feminism has always seemed to me to be most closely related to second wave, what I would call materialist feminism, or maybe what Catherine McKinnon called in 1987 or 1987, feminism unmodified, her book. There's always been a much stronger tradition of materialist feminism or socialist feminism in Europe than in the United States, especially over the last 40 years or so. So do you think that one reason gender critical feminism seems so surprising to so many Americans anyway, in the American context, is its focus on materiality? And that's so, especially considering that so much of online feminist discourse is driven, well, online discourse in general is driven by Americans, by American social media companies, and our very sort of US specific focus context of understanding. So maybe the question is also not just about gender critical feminism being surprising in the US context, but maybe explain for the audience a little bit your understanding of how gender critical feminism fits into this broader, more US based history of feminism.
Yeah, can I just clarify something first though? So for me, materialist feminism, there's two ways I've seen it used. One is just referring to like the embodiment, the materiality of the person, and not getting caught up in like a dualism that favors the mind. And the other way is really Marxist, right? It's like buying into a lot of Marxist theory where that would more mean something like socialist feminism. So which way are you?
I guess I was thinking more the former.
Okay.
But I think since I invoke Catherine McKinnon, she's got clearly more of a Marxist sort of orientation. Yeah. So I guess I didn't understand as a historian that there were those that there was a way to separate those strands out. So you're much more knowledgeable than I am on this. So answer as you will. Is in fact gender critical feminism a kind of an extension of second wave feminism with the materialist approach?
I think it's a clear extension of the radical faction.
The radical faction. Okay.
So yeah. Your second wave feminism, as it emerged, had your what do you use?
Liberal
feminists. It had your moderates, like your reformers, your liberals, your
Betty Friedan.
Yes, Betty Friedan, the National Organization of Women.
Yeah.
And then it had its like women who got really fed up and frustrated that wasn't radical enough, that the actions weren't spicy enough, that they were constantly putting class first, that they were I sound more knowledgeable than I should because this is my current book project. They talk about the invisible audience of male leftist heavies. So the idea is that these women are just like constantly with their left-wing boyfriends and their left-wing anti-Vietnam movement, and they're all up in that progressive stuff, and they're not being pro-women enough. So there's this like the pro-women faction or the women's liberationists as opposed to the politicos or the left movement women. So for me, the gender critical feminist tradition picks up and is continuous with the radical feminist splinter of the second wave feminist movement. And they were the women that really wanted to zero in on this idea of sex. Now it's confusing because class, but not in the Marxist sense, sex, class, taking female people to be a social group that has disadvantage or is oppressed, whichever word you prefer, and needs its own theory and analysis. That's the starting point. They don't want to put class first and think that women's liberation will fall out of the class revolution. They deny that it's going to fall out of any of these other progressive movements. They want people to be theorizing and thinking about women, so women are first. So that's what I think gender critical feminism, with its focus on the importance and history of sex and what has been done on the basis of sex. And it's the same project in terms of like, there's more questions than answers, but it's like trying to figure out, yeah, what is this? What are these ideas about femininity, or what has happened to women in history, and what's the structural legacy of those kind of terrible laws or constraints? All that work, I think a lot of it still needs to be done, but I see the gender critical movement as picking that up and sort of trying to do it again. And that's what I'm trying to do in my book.
So why do you think that gender critical feminism had to kind of reconstitute itself to address that kind of materialist, radical feminist strain? What happened to feminism globally? Although we were talking about the American context, you can answer this in the American context or the global context. Why was it left there to be picked up again? Why did that not become the mainstream feminism as you talk about it in your book?
I mean, there's an interesting question as to exactly why I'm going to say failed, even though this really pisses off the existing and alive radical feminists who are the original ones, because they're like, we're still here, we're not dead yet was the title of a recent collection. So it's annoying to them when you say radical feminism failed. Radical feminism. Okay, there are still some, and they've been active this whole time. I acknowledge that. Alice Eccles, in her history of radical feminism, puts the dates 1967 to 1975. Done. Dead. 1975, you're dead. And part of that is attributed to the losing of the sex wars. So I think that's supposed to play a pretty major role, that like it just became uncool and unfashionable and obviously unsexy to be anti-sex, anti-porn, anti-prostitution and so on. But I'm sure there's a much more complicated explanation that I'm not fully across as to why it died. Like, my main interest has been into how it started, like who the initial figures were and what their ideas were. I'm looking for the theory. So sometimes there's just a rant and then, okay, quickly skim that and try to find the theory. So I've been more at the start than the end. But yeah, feminism that had a focus on, so one thing was the feminism for everyone, including men, bringing more people in. And another thing is the intersectionality move, which is bringing in more intersections with sex and gender, which has the effect of bringing in a lot more stuff to the feminist agenda. And then, yeah, this kind of pro-sex line. Those are three things I can sort of think of off the top of my head where third wave feminism took over. And one thing I'm trying to argue in the book is like the thing that we have now that has the name feminism, it's a global justice movement. And that's fine. Like that's actually great that there's a global justice movement. There's this movement that takes everything to be its job, all oppression, all injustice everywhere. Great, but would be cool if we could also have feminism, like this thing that Catherine McKinnon meant by feminism unmodified.
Yeah.
So why not? And what could possibly be the objection? There, we have that for every other group, right? Any group that you think of as oppressed, we have a theory and analysis of what that oppression consists in or what their history is. So why is it just female people that are somehow supposed to not have that, but we just have this big amorphous global justice movement for everyone and about all issues? So that's one of the things I'm trying to argue is like, we call it feminism, but when you look at its list of demands or all the things it thinks it has to do, that's global justice. Okay, so let's get a feminist movement back as well. And that's what gender critical feminism is, in my view.
Well, that takes me to another question. I do want to pursue some more questions for you about what happened to radical feminism at the end of the 70s. I've always understood it to be maybe more something that had to do with either the overreach or the lack of ability to predict technological changes that sort of screwed up the anti-porn side of that movement, right? With Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon. And didn't they pass in the Minneapolis City Council an anti-porn bill in 1979? but they didn't see, videotape and the movement of, the facilitation of pornography through technology that became the story of pornography in the 80s, 90s, and certainly the 2000s now with the internet.
But they lost before that, right? Like, I mean, they got their ordinances through, and then they were almost immediately pushed back. They didn't have the public will to maintain that. Lots of feminist infight. I think I've just been reviewing Nadine Strossen's 3rd edition of her old Defending Pornography book. I think that movement that she was one of gained in power. So it's not as though it's just that the internet brought porn to a wider audience and it became uncontrollable, despite there being the will, right? Something also shifted in the will and shifted in what feminists themselves, which I don't fully understand. Maybe you.
Well, I guess my perspective as an American individual and an American historian is that a lot of American feminists were very jealously guarding the First Amendment. I remember a lot of my professors in the 1980s and 1990s when I was in college and graduate school being very, very skeptical of the feminist anti-porn movement. We grad students were very much in favor of the more radical vision. But the senior professors and even somewhat junior professors, older than us professors, they were warning us like, no, anytime you go for censorship, this is something that's going to be used against feminism. Was their warning.
That sounds like Strossen's argument.
Yeah,
it's very
exactly.
interesting. Yeah.
Well, she's coming very much out of that academic tradition. She was a law professor, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, there is certainly something to her arguments. The way that censorship can sort of make something sexy and appealing. So that's not a great way to get rid of something that people already find sexy and appealing, make it more sexy and appealing. So there is this question of what is the best way to oppose pornography. And so maybe it was a misstep to try to do this top-down banning. I still feel quite conflicted on this issue because I would like to see an abolition, just in the sense of that we don't have it anymore, of both prostitution and pornography, but I haven't fully worked out, just as a political philosopher, when is it fine for the state to just do that, take a thing away from everyone, and when does it have to come from a grassroots movement? And so far I've limited myself to arguing when is it wrong to buy sex book. I'm just arguing you shouldn't be willing to buy sex from these often quite vulnerable people. That's unethical consumption. But I'm not arguing the state should use its power to take that option away from people. But I'm not sure if I would be entitled to argue that yet. I don't know that piece of the puzzle in terms of when you're I suspect it's something to do with the amount of harm, and there is quite a lot. But I haven't fully got my head around that or worked out when you're allowed to be a tyrant about a certain topic. So yeah.
That might connect to my question later on about gender critical feminism and liberalism. Hold that thought. Anyway, let's pursue this question about the relationship between gender critical feminism and other social justice movements, which you sort of mentioned towards the end of your discussion of the historical question I asked you, the first one I asked you. In the introduction of your book, you write about how feminists became the support humans for every other leftist cause, which asks feminists, as you write on page 4, quote, would you mind just taking care of these 6,789 other social justice issues while you're at it? This is a question for you now, is this because women's studies became gender, women, and sexuality studies, do you think? Or something like that in the beginning in the 1990s? Do you think it's because feminism itself started backing away from women as its central focus? Or do you think that this was inevitable for a movement by and for women, that it would kind of be turned into the mommy movement, as we were discussing earlier, the hapless rump of social justice movements? Please clean up this mess, Mom.
I mean, it's such a good question. I want to say no, just because, again, my focus has been so much on these radical splinter women, and they are so ferocious. Like they know what they stand for. Some of them are like full separatists. They're amazingly committed, and they have a real analysis and I don't think those are the kind of women that then just like slowly become doormats.
Give it away. Like,
Yeah. So then it does need some other explanation. And again, one that I run in the book, but it's really kind of a bit just a suggestion, is this idea that like women became used to being accused of exclusion, and sometimes it was true. And so that made them less gatekeepery about when they would accommodate. So I think the anecdote that I used was like a real thing that happened. And do you remember what I can't remember the name of the conference, but it's like this big American women's conference, and the opening speech of it was like the phrase
the
was,
North American Women's Studies Association.
Yes.
NASA.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. So that there was this phrase in it, a litany of abuses. So there was this melodramatic opening speech where the person says, oh, the lesbian sisters have walked out. We've really let down the lesbian sisters. And then the Jewish caucus, oh, they were so persecuted. And then, oh, the black book. So that it's like this listing of the minority group women and all the ways they had been like perceived to be mistreated within the Women's Studies Association. And so I'm sort of using that as a jumping off point for like, yeah, you can be a feminist group and do something actually exclusionary, right? It's like you can just really mess up and then be so embarrassed about, you thought you were a social justice person, but you did this big embarrassing mistake. And then, but if that keeps happening, right, you become more open to the idea that you can make these kind of mistakes, you can be exclusionary even when you're really trying. You can have these huge blind spots. So then, okay, you're a little less careful next time the next group comes along and makes its criticism. That's the sort of thought. And again, I don't know, I'm just putting an idea out there for consideration. But to me, it seemed like maybe that's something that happens. Like these feminist groups, yeah, they really were sometimes getting big racial things wrong or whatever. And then when the next issue comes along that they actually should say no to, they should say, no, that's not a feminist issue. Great issue. Do that in another group, or that actually belongs over there in this other movement. They should say no, but they don't. So that for me, that's the only thing that when I've really given it some thought as to how did this happen, that we ended up saying yes to all these things and in a way looking like being a bit doormats.
Yeah.
But I don't know, yeah, how plausible. That's just the thing I could come up with.
Well, I want to pursue this question of what's going on with, what happened in the second wave here just a little bit more. I was interested in how US focused your discussion of second wave feminism was. And that was a really nice sort of primer for me, because I typically teach 17th, 18th, and 19th century history. So this is not, necessarily my research bailiwick. So it was the good refresher for me. So in citing Phyllis Chesler's recent autobiography, which sounds like a good read, would you recommend?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Joe Freeman's classic essay on trashing, and even Christina Hoff Sommers' book 30 years ago now, Who Stole Feminism? I liked how you show how messy and contentious second wave feminism was, which suggests that feminists today should not be surprised by the divisions among them. I think, as a historian, that would be a natural sort of impulse for me, a lesson for me to draw. So do you have any ideas or strategies for feminists today in managing these seemingly unbridgeable differences within feminism? Or cautionary tales, perhaps?
I'm not sure I have strategies, but I would just say for me, it actually helped a lot. The experience of doing feminist politics with other women in the room, like not just abstractly learning about it, but like trying to do something. And
Getting out of the library.
And the online experience, of course, which is much more vitriolic than the in-person experience. It helped me a lot to learn about that history, and to especially Joe Freeman's trashing essay, because then you just, this is completely normal. Like these are the normal dynamics that, and maybe actually I thought it was an interesting research question. Is there something about feminist movement, or is this every movement? Like, are all the leftist movements also having dramatic falling out with
People's
each
Front
other
versus the People's Front of Judea
Yes,
problems? Yeah,
exactly.
Okay,
Do they hate each other with a passion? Were they used to be friends and lovers and now they despise each other and can't be in the same room and it's hard to organize the dinner? But like, is everything like that, or is feminism especially like that? And if so, why? And I didn't really manage to solve that problem, that I at least learned that this is enough the normal state of affairs, that what's happening now with gender critical feminism, it's not that unusual historically.
Yeah.
But in terms of lessons, I mean, all that really suggests is like, don't be alarmed or worried when you come in, like when you join and it's not pleasant. It's not going to be pleasant. And maybe some of the discourse in the second wave about sisterhood, I think, was a bit dangerous in that respect, because it misled people to think, come on into feminism and you'll have a really lovely time. You'll have all these new sisters.
Cookies and snuggles and blankets for everyone.
Yeah, and of course, when the reality is so different to that,
Right.
it's really disheartening. And I think Freeman she seemed quite traumatized by it. Like she dropped out and then
Yeah.
she wrote about this terrible experience. Whereas if you go in thinking, yeah, it's not going to be nice, but I'm doing something important and I can contribute in these ways, then you have a more realistic, you probably got more stickability over the long term because you're not getting crushed and then leaving. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn now to a more philosophy question, which was inspired by our colleague Moti Gorin's review of your book in the Philosopher's Magazine, because it jived with the question that I had about, especially about liberalism. So I'm gonna quote Moti's review, because you asked me to, but I also thought I wouldn't be able to rephrase the question better. So I thought I would go ahead.
I asked her to because I wasn't confident I'd remember the details this time later.
Okay. Gender critical feminism does not celebrate choice per se. This is Moti. Gender critical feminism does not celebrate choice per se. As she puts it, the gender critical feminist is not concerned to avoid the paternalism of interference with choices that are rational responses to sexist social norms. The question then is how to distinguish between choices that are worthy of protection and respect and those that are not, and how to balance the costs of prohibition against the costs of toleration. This is perhaps the practical question of political liberalism, and although Lawford-Smith does not offer a definitive answer, it is clear that gender critical feminism departs from a feminism, a liberal feminism, what do you call it, contemporary mainstream feminism, that celebrates women's choices simply because they were made by women. I call this choosy choice feminism. So this is a question about basically, when can you accuse someone of false consciousness? When can you legitimately criticize a choice from the position of as a gender critical feminist?
Yeah, I guess the gender critical feminist is much more concerned about the background structures and causes and explanations of why women are making the choices they are today, and fully acknowledges that those choices can be rational responses to the current incentives and constraints, but really wants to talk about why are they making those choices, and for that not to be the end of the story. I think there's something quite unsatisfying about the very autonomy focused feminism that just says, don't worry about how she got there. Wherever she is, whatever she chooses, we support her. Like, that's just about, yeah, I think that is the sort of toothless current liberal view. But that doesn't result, that just says you've got two different kinds of feminism, and one is caring more about these background explanations. It doesn't quite give you the answer to what you're allowed to do about it, right? And again, this comes back to the early, I think, my point about me having to fill in the details of when I can become the tyrant, right? Because it's all still bottom up. It's like, I want gender non-conforming girls to stay gender non-conforming girls and contribute to the heterogeneity of what it means to be a woman. I want women to think carefully about why they would sexually objectify themselves on Instagram. But I'm not saying ban flesh on Instagram, or maybe I am saying stop transitioning children, but I don't think I would say that about adults. Maybe there's an interesting question there. sex asymmetry. But yeah, but it's the same question. I still need to work out when I would be allowed to say ban it. I don't know.
Do you think that this that the gender critical feminism is therefore maybe more naturally suited for academia than for the streets because of this insistence on thinking through the social, political, and perhaps historical context for women's condition?
I mean, I guess there's theory and then there's movement. So I would imagine that most gender critical feminists, most people in the world today that call themselves gender critical feminists, have watched a Kelly J. Keane YouTube video and have not read a Holly Lawford-Smith book, and that's probably good, right? So yeah, theory is not of interest to everyone. I sort of try to make the case in the book that it can be useful to everyone, like it's useful for movements to have a roadmap, and theory can be very helpful, but I don't know if it's a reason why gender critical feminism fits better or should stay in the academy, because there are gender critical feminists that are without theory still kind of speaking pretty
Forcefully.
yeah, and in a way I've been really, I interviewed Kelly J. Keane for Paulette, and one of the things I was saying to her is like, do you really not read theory? Because she always says in her podcast she doesn't read theory, she's not reading any, but she's spot on. Like she'll just do these rants and she's just, from my point of view, absolutely spot on in her feminist analysis. So there's this interesting question of like the more popular, it's like we're all trying to get at the same problems and articulate the same sorts of things. Yeah, just maybe some of us are doing it in a more and less accessible way or have different preoccupations. So I'm bringing my whatever skill set as a philosopher, and yeah, maybe that it's not going to be the thing that helps the most people, but maybe it's helpful to some of the people that are more interested in that ideas and roadmap and where to next part of the equation, and then that's my contribution if it is one. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to turn it over to the audience for questions now.
So I'm hearing two questions. One is about like who is welcome in this movement, or who, anyone, who should we work with? Anyone is welcome. I'm totally on board with that. So I don't know if that's the main thing in your question. Is it sort of a left-wing project? Is it just this group of people, or is it for everyone? I think everyone is welcome. I think Kelly J. Keane does tend to talk more in the language of the single issue focus, but one of the things that I'm really trying to do in the book is explain why women are having such a strong reaction to this idea of sex self-identification. And this relates to the things I said earlier on, that like, because sex has been really important in our history, because we still need it for theorizing women's situation historically and today, more or less in different countries, these are resources that we need. So I mean, it's true that there's a real preoccupation with trans issues, but I think that is explained by the fact that that movement is posing a threat to these things that women see matter for them, and that they have a right to hang on to language to talk about themselves and their situation. So yeah, do I disapprove of her? Not, yeah, I don't really disapprove of her saying that, but I do. I guess if I could, like, I wish she would speak more broadly about all of the sex-based issues rather than be so focused on that thing, but that is her thing for now. That is correct. I believe that that person does not belong in the group. I think that it's possible that some male people are treated in the way that female people are treated, but I think the feminist movement is about female people and the way that they are treated, even if that has some effects on people who are not female. So the feminist movement will be good for those people, but it is not for or about those people. So I think Haslinger's account misses why people are discriminated against. We don't think that like people who look female are bad at maths, right? We think whatever the pop science is that backs that view up, like women's lady brains or whatever, that's a story about female people. No, it's not about perceived. If you found out that someone who looked female was in fact male, you would not think they're bad at maths. So this might feel like quibbling, right? Like, but Haslinger's story is just, it's in the now. It's like as though all that matters is discrimination in the now. And then all the people who look female are subjected to this anti-femininity or anti-apparent femaleness discrimination. We've got 3,000 years of anti-female treatment to account for. It's not just the moment now of who happens to look like a female person. So I think the gender critical explanation has more to offer in the sense of like, what is this class of people? What is their history? What is the legacy of that? It's femaleness and the way that that is subordinated. It's not being perceived to be female, but if we pointed out that you weren't, that would probably drop away. That's the difference. I don't know if you think that's very different, but for me, that the explanations are quite distinct. What are you thinking is the explanation of the mistreatment? I mean, say you just have a very like a person with 3 or 4 traits that are taken to be like on the oppressed side of the equation, but then you want to say that person's experience counts for gender, like I think I'm not sure it's true that it's really so different. I know this tends to be, yeah, throughout time and across different cultures, there's an awful lot of commonality too, like child sexual abuse, rape, like these things that are to do with like female sexuality and female reproductive role, the female body, that maybe there's a bit more variation in the stuff that's like built on, like it's the female body that marks her, but now she's bad at maths. Okay, maybe there's a bit more cultural and temporal variation in that. But so that's one thing where I don't really buy the claim. And then I don't see the connection from, well, if it's a bit different for each society's females, suddenly it's also, why not also add in these female appearing non-female people's treatment? I don't get that.
So
like it might be that the mechanisms for what keep female people subordinated over time change. So it might be that they like started out as one thing, like yeah, men having greater control over the hunting and then getting fraternity that women did. There's all these theories, right? So maybe it's, and then but by 1,000 years later, it's quite different. Then I can sort of take the point, like whatever it is at that time, surely that's our big concern now, regardless of the history of how that got going. That's interesting for the historian, but it's not interesting if your project is get rid of current oppression. But I'm just not convinced that I mean, yeah, maybe we just have to talk more, but I'm not convinced that female oppression globally today doesn't have a clear relation to its history. And I find it strange that no one does this. It's like, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, I'm just saying I feel sometimes that this is motivated by the wish for trans inclusion when it's made elsewhere. Because nobody does this about Jews and the Holocaust or African Americans and slavery. Nobody says, stop talking about your history. Let's just think about people who have the features that look the way that your people look now and how they're discriminated against. And let's focus on that. Nobody says that. People care about the explanation for that group's subordination and mistreatment. The history is always foremost and part of the the political movement and the protection against ever going back to that state. And I think feminists just, well, radical and gender critical feminists, they just have that in mind too. Let's never go back to any of those states when we're owned by a man in marriage or whatever. So that's just something, maybe we can talk more about that, but it's just, why is it different for feminism and nothing else? How could females use gender identity to explain their oppression today? Because it's not just giving the tool. It's not like, here's a useful tool, you can't have it, I'm just being stingy. It's like, no, gender for the second waiver means enculturation into femininity because of femaleness. The trans activists make it mean internal subjective sense of yourself in terms of femininity or being a woman or being female. How could that possibly help women? Thanks. I mean, obviously, I agree with a lot of that. One thing I say, I think, quite briefly in the book is that, like, there's been an asymmetric demand for allyship, I feel, between the two movements. So there's this huge sense of women needing to be allies to trans women's issues kind of being really important. And part of this is this idea of the difference to the worst off, or priority to the least well off. And there hasn't been this reciprocal push for trans women to be allies to women. And there are some obvious issues where this shows up, like, you know, it's still important to be able to talk about the traditionally important female issues like abortion or like period poverty or whatever else. So when there's a push to not talk about those issues or not center those issues because they're exclusionary, because not all women have those experiences, I think that is a form of poor reciprocal allyship, even in a movement where we did want to be inclusive and have everyone there. And for me, the bigger question is why it's so rare and hard to hear people say what you just said, like, and why is it scary? Like, how did we get to the point where, again, like I said in response to the last question, no one does this for any other movement. And so it just, you know, yeah, for me, there's a real mystery here about how we got to this point, that women pushing back like that or standing up for their concepts or the importance of their movement or their lives or their oppression is just seen as this terrible, bigoted, outrageous thing. Yeah, and I think maybe there's like a lot to be said there about feminine stereotypes. And this goes back to your point, I think, Anne, about the sort of the mum of the movement. Like, yeah, she's
Clean it up, mom.
yeah, she's supposed to be self-effacing.
Yeah,
She's supposed to put other people first. The stereotype of the woman is being imported into her liberation movement and then used against her to put other people's issues first or to bring other people in. For me, it's just one of those mind-blowing things, but we are where we are.
Can I just make a quick comment? I was really intrigued by your comment that women are enslaved to their biology. I think that has historically been the case, but it's only been fairly recently that hasn't been entirely the case. And I think that's something that a lot of modern Americans have really lost sight of. We're now into our third generation of women who don't necessarily have to give birth because of hormonal birth control for the most part, and because of legalized abortion. And I think that it would do us all well to think carefully about what this means in terms of our own relationships to our bodies and reproduction, not just women, men as well. Because I think this has been a real massive revolution in the way that human beings relate to the rest of the natural world, how we relate to other animals, how we relate to ourselves. And so I just wanted to make the comment that I appreciated you bringing up the question of the disadvantages of female biology in some contexts, and to point out that it's only fairly recently that many of us have been able to grow up and achieve adulthood parenthood and even grandparenthood, perhaps, without necessarily being as enmeshed in our own biology. That's what I wanted to say.
Question over here.
Oh, yeah.
I don't believe that privilege, that, what was the phrase? Prioritizing the most privileged women. That's not a project of gender critical feminism or radical feminism. There's a frequent mischaracterization, I think, for political purposes of second wave feminism and radical feminism. And I think largely when you look back, it wasn't true. But if you look at my book, you look at the coda with the manifesto in it. If you look at what I say in the discussions about intersectionality, there's still plenty of room to center or prioritize the worst off women. The point of gender critical feminism is to have a theory and movement for, by, and about women as women. So it limits the scope of the issues to women's issues. But it's not, that's not, I mean, most women are women of color, most women are poor. But there's not remotely an equivalence between that project and the sort of smear that would be something like, oh, this is a white middle class Hollywood women project or whatever. I think that it's a real mistake to think because something is about female people as a class that it's somehow only about the most privileged women. No, it's not about disability and race where they are not intersected with sex issues, but it's of course about women with disabilities and women of color. So maybe you can recommend your department and I recommend my book, and we both learn something. When you say trans women, who are you including in the cohort? What's the trait to you that puts you in the group? For any reason, not childhood gender dysphoria, not passing, not presenting as a woman, not just any reason, anyone who identifies as a woman? Because then no, then my answer is absolutely not. That group is not more oppressed than women. Like, it's such a complex cohort, right? Because there just are some people in that group. They're very different histories, very different reasons, like the sort of, I don't know what the best way to call that, but the movement that comes out of the Judith Butler style gender studies, gender fuck, gender queer, that stuff, playing with gender, that's not an oppressed group. But there might be some reason to think someone with serious childhood gender dysphoria, someone who's had trouble like being read between the sexes, someone who passes and so has experienced treatment as a woman. I'm much more open to talking about those cases. But if you're doing trans women as a cohort, including everyone on the contemporary trans activist understanding of what it means to be a trans woman, I absolutely would deny that their group is oppressed. And certainly then they can't be more oppressed than women. Yeah, but I don't think you're going to like the answer because I think a lot of it is homophobia and femphobia about males. And again, I think that's a very, like, it's related. The bigger project about what gender does to both sexes, that like should make us allies, but for some reason it doesn't, but it should. But I would analyze that as like, if a feminine male person is kind of beaten up in public or slurred or whatever, that is most of the time going to be a reaction to the perception that he is not appropriately performing masculinity. It's not going to be part and parcel of the same story about why women or the ways in which women are mistreated in public life or what women's problems are. It's gender, but it's not femaleness. I mean, do you disagree with that? Because I'm interested in what like, because to me that seems so obviously true. I know that sounds stupid, but like that, I can't see what else it could be. That I can agree with that. If somebody appears female, they will be treated as female people are treated. Although this goes back to the earlier point, I can't remember, was it your point about if they then said, oh, stop it, I'm trans, I'm actually male, I was born male, would it stop? And my intuition, maybe I'm wrong, is that it would stop. But worse because they're reacting then to the threat to masculinity and maleness, or worse because they believe you're a woman and think you're doing it wrong. Deal with me, right? I haven't done those things. I know the gender critical movement is wild sometimes and it's offensive. I know that. I'm not saying those things. I think it matters when you are mistreated, why? I think that is relevant. And if the person, you know, whoever it is, if that person is responding to their ideas about maleness, I do think that's relevant, that the feminist would say, okay, yeah, it's a separate thing. It's really important and it's shit, but it is a separate thing, actually. Yes. The only case I get, speaking for myself, I haven't seen that. And I've only very recently, like in the last 2 weeks, met the first person in my life who is female but looks male because of an intersex condition, not being trans, and seen some vitriol coming from the lesbian community. But that's not something that I see happening regularly. And I couldn't police the gender critical feminists for the way they for the fact that they want male gender nonconformity to be treated as male gender nonconformity, because I believe, like, I'm on their side in that respect. I'm confused about the claim. I'm not discarding them. My whole chapter about trans issues in this book is about gender nonconforming girls, people getting, like, the concerns that the gender critical movement has about girls that would just be gender nonconforming, girls that are lesbians, being kind of medicalized, the reduction of heterogeneity in what it means to be female or ways to be a woman. We're very concerned with that, but we're concerned with the female part of the trans community. I just checked, did you finish your questions or you got hijacked slightly? We can do both. Yeah, it sounds to me like you just said, if we include trans women as women, then we include trans women as women. The question of whether they should be included depends on whether they are women, and that's the disagreement. Right, so the gender critical and the rad femmes say, no, the constituency for feminism is female people, and that's a biological concept, and trans women are male. So they're just disagreeing about what a woman is and who their constituency is. And I think we have a better argument because we have all of history on our side. But of course, you're right that, like, if you are already committed to, no, the concept is self-identifying as a woman or being feminine in some way, whatever the concept you want to fill in, then of course that's your cohort, that's your constituency. And then you can start talking about who's the worst off and what issues should be prioritized. But yeah, that is the disagreement, I think. Like, I don't think so, but this is the first time like anyone's been willing to talk to me. So I'm happy to talk more about this. I think it's a really important question. Maybe there are some, and then maybe we have to kind of move a little bit. So far, I think not, because I tend to think the nonconformity over on the male side is just, it has a whole different bunch of stuff going on. That's right. I mean, what I hear in your point is that, yeah, people have different, the term I use in the book, which is borrowed from one of the second waivers, is primary state of emergency. Each person has an identity or more where that's the thing that's salient for them or causing them the most difficulties in their daily life. And then, of course, you're going to relate more to people who also share those issues. I'm just not sure how that's a feminist point on my conception of feminism, right? So you could be female and experience no problems or few problems to do with your femaleness and much more to do with your parent status. That I don't think that really affects anything that I'm saying, except for maybe that if you're choosing which movement to join, you would join a parent one, like whatever. I mean, a lot of what I've been arguing is that this kind of what I think of as mainstream feminism, which takes all these issues together at once, we need a female-focused movement as well, women's issues as women. So there is, of course, that movement that tries to roll all the aspects of the person together at once. One of the things I'm arguing against in that book is that type of movement. I think it's overburdened. So yeah, I mean, I can take your point that there's just other people you'll relate to more, and that sometimes might be trans women, but I don't see that that affects my argument. Yeah. I don't think I get the question. Do you?
I think what Holly would say, based on my reading of her book, is that feminism is for women. That's the difference. That yes, it does have some things in common with other social justice movements, especially being anti-oppression. But I think she would say that feminism is about identifying women and the issues that are specific to women.
Does that,
or
is that not what you were getting?
I don't know. Yeah.
Wasn't it? Please feel free to
elaborate if you like. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I wasn't claiming that for every disagreement between gender critical feminism and its opponents, it's a fundamental moral disagreement. I think you're right that the disagreement just is about who are the targets of the analysis, and are we talking about gender identity or are we talking about biological sex? But I would just add to that you can make a pretty good case for why biological sex on the female side is an oppressed class going back in time. And I don't think, although I think we can argue about that obviously, that gender identity picks out an oppressed class. And even if it did, or even if it picked out, we use some slightly weaker word like disadvantaged, discriminated against, they're very different. They have different explanations and different mechanisms, very different histories. So the disagreements like what's your topic, and then what's the analysis of that topic's situation and history and so on. But that's not supposed to be the fundamental moral disagreement. Yeah. Why did you assign yourself power just then? As an academic? As a female? As a what? I mean, presumably you could just do this as social science, right? You don't have to make it a matter of different hierarchies between women or. Set that aside, someone in the psychology department who has no vested interest decides to come up with a coherent concept of misogyny and look at its prevalence. There's tools they can use to like, well, okay, this thing clearly isn't, these things are clearly contested cases, this is a paradigm case, this is the number, right? This is the kind of thing that we could study and try to figure out the prevalence of and maybe argue over the margins of. That's not a thing where a person of power arbitrarily stipulates that this thing's in and this thing's out, right? Or at least I don't have that kind of hyper social constructionist view of all concepts, and misogyny being one of them. This is a real phenomenon and it has explanations. You could interview the misogynists and find out what was up with them. Like, that would be interesting, right? It's not. So I'm just curious about you saying, yeah, you're in this position of power. Who are you to say that that's not? If they say it is, it is. Absolutely not. Like, yeah, I'm just going to believe everyone who says a thing now. With what rules? That maybe that's politics, but it's certainly not academia. It's certainly not science. But this is now you're going scientific, right? And that's great. Like I'm on board with that. If it turns out that for this neutral person who comes along and studies it, finds out, like the essence of catcalling is sense of sexual entitlement, sense that you have to look attractive to me and I'm going to police you on that. And it turns out the kind of harassment on the street that trans women get is the same as non-trans women get. That would be a very interesting discovery that I would want to take seriously. But that is not, who am I to say from my position of power or whatever, that we just have to defer to whatever someone that you've designated as less powerful say. I mean, I just feel like we're just arguing about is there full latitude in how we conceptualize the world, or is there some real stuff? I'm very much on the side of real stuff. Real phenomenon. It's not just up to us. It's not just an exercise of power. It's not just a social construction. There's real phenomena. Oh, but a social scientist could do a pretty good job of studying misogyny. I know some people who do. It's not arbitrary, right? Like, and it would be interesting, as I said, it would be interesting to discover that there are commonalities, or to discover that there really aren't. This is homophobia, and this is entitlement to women's sexuality or whatever. That is an empirical question. It would be great to find out what the answer is. Like, what's your goal? My goal would be to stop discrimination against women, like to stop misogyny. Then it's quite useful to have an understanding of what the perpetrators are doing and why. And I think this tracks back to my answer to several questions, right? Like, the history matters because we want to know why. We want to stop this thing. We want a diagnosis. Like that's the grand theory of female class. Like, what's going on here and how do we stop it? So I don't know if I'm so interested in that someone feels like a victim and then tells you their experience. But there's also a controversy about the claims made by trans women and about the ideology behind that, which is why we're all here. So I don't think you can just say this is a flat out clear justice issue and it's being like not taken up enough in academia as though it's straightforward. No, we're arguing where there's resistance against that ideology for a reason, for the reasons that we've been talking about. I want to go back to something earlier in your question. So there's a sense in which I think that what you said is right about the methodology of the early second wavers developing consciousness raising. So it's true that they had to sort of get together as women, share their experiences, and try to find patterns. But again, I think that's a sort of social science pseudo, because it's informal, but it's a social science methodology. It could turn out that when they look for patterns, someone is an outlier, right? Like, it could be that you can unify about 70% of those experiences, but you just can't, this thing just doesn't fit in. So we actually just end up thinking, for these theoretical reasons, for unity, for simplicity, for coherence, for whatever, this is going to be our concept of sexual harassment. It's not going to have 100% consensus experience plugged into it and accounted for. We're using this stuff as input to try to get rigorous, helpful concepts that can do work in the movement out of that. And I think the move I don't understand is the parallel of that would be trans people getting together, doing consciousness raising, sharing their experiences, coming up with an analysis of their situation. But I don't see any link from that to feminists must automatically include trans women as women and believe any testimony about experience coming from a trans woman is part of feminist analysis of women's experiences. You need to argue for that. Well, that's part of what I'm arguing. You need to argue for that. Yes, lots of progressives believe it, but in my experience, it's not argued for. Yeah, so I want to make sure I say all the things I'm trying to think to say, because I had an argument with Kathleen about this that was helpful. So in my newer book, the Sex Matters book, I'm very clear about this point for intersex people, and I think that helps to show there's no biology in it. So if you have an intersex condition that is technically male, but you are assigned female at birth in the real sense of assigned female at birth, I just think there's absolutely no case for the gender critical side to think that that person should not be in female only spaces. So that, and I'm very clear that's not the kind of cases I'm interested in. The only people I think might disagree with that are some of the difference feminists or the reactionary feminists, because the more that you pack into innate sex differences based on biology, the more you're going to think the biology from birth is relevant. I don't think that. Okay, then I got very interested for a while, and a little bit in the book, in the trans chapter, I do talk about this question of whether and to what extent trans women and trans women of different kinds are like women. And I think there's some interesting literature there, in particular that the gay males that are, I don't know how to say that properly, but that there is more femininity there than in the case of the older transitioning heterosexual males. So that in terms of if the thing that matters is being like females in terms of shared experience or whatever, you've got more latitude to divide the cohort that way. So I do think there's this interesting question, and there's an interesting question, what's the thing that gender critical feminists, radical feminists actually care about? What they care about is male socialization. They care about socialization on the basis of sex from birth and what that does to male and female people and how hard that is to throw off. And they think it's really hard. They don't think you just change the opportunities in society or change the laws and then everyone is suddenly the same. They think that you're shaped, there's a legacy of sort of shaping you into the person that you are. So I do think there's an interesting question, like at what age or how long do you have to be passing as a woman and treated as a woman to throw off, like how long does male socialize? I think that's interesting. When I argued with Kathleen about this, her rejoinder was, none of that matters because women can never be expected to detect. So when a woman sees a male and recognizes a male, how on earth is she supposed to know how much work he has done, like how much feminist literature he has read, or how much of his socialization, or how early he transitioned, whatever? If the thing about women only spaces is about having clear social norms that we abide by for these reasons to do with women's interests, that question, which for me is really interesting philosophically, is just kind of beside the point, because yeah, you could get this person born male who's just had extensive experience or really done the work or is actually a way better feminist than any of you, but women could not be expected to know that about him because they don't know him. And I find that quite persuasive, but it's like, yeah, I'm getting sucked into this philosophical question about when the male becomes less male-like or whatever, instead of thinking about what are the sensible rules that we have in place and why. So it'd be good to talk more about that. I don't think,
I started with a word of thanks and I want to close. Thank you both for being willing to engage, to be willing to open to have your ideas challenged. Yes, that's my next thank you. Nobody in this room had to be here. We appreciate your willingness to come, your willingness to engage, and whether we end up leaving in disagreement, that's okay, right? But maybe we move the notch a little bit forward in terms of trying to understand. And so thanks for coming. We appreciate it. We hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.